He was Alistair Valerius, a CEO whose net worth eclipsed the GDP of a small country. She was Nolan Vance, a waitress struggling to pay for her brother's medicine. At the most expensive restaurant in New York, surrounded by the city's elite, Alistair Valerius, drunk on power, pointed a finger at her. "If you can sing this opera aria," he smirked, "I'll marry you." The room of billionaires laughed, but as Nolan walked to the stage, they didn't know she had once been Juilliard's prodigy, and she was about to sing for her life. The air at L'Etoile simply breathable. It was designed, tempered to a perfect cool, faintly perfumed with something expensive and florals based. It created an atmosphere that didn't just exclude, but dismissed. Eating here required more than wealth. It required heritage. Suspended 60 floors above Central Park, the restaurant glittered with crystal chandeliers, muffled footsteps, and the gentle clink of cutlery worth more than most studio apartments. For Nolan Vance, it was merely another Tuesday. She tugged at the tight black pencil skirt of her uniform, its seams worn to near transparency, hoping the starched apron hid the fraying threads. At 24, Nolan still moved with the poise drilled into her at Juilliard, but her grey eyes carried a heaviness that no stage light could brighten. 3 years ago, those eyes had tracked choreography and applause. Now they tracked empty water glasses. "Vance!" Mr. Dubois hissed. The spine was as rigid as the collar of his impeccable suit. "The Valerius party is in private salon B. And try not to spill anything. This isn't the diner you come from." "Yes, Mr. Dubois." Her reply was neutral, clipped, obedient. At L'Etoile d'Or, survival meant invisibility. The patrons didn't want servers. They wanted illusions, food appearing as if summoned, plates vanishing without sound, desires fulfilled by silent, disciplined shadows. Nolan had become an expert shadow. Salon B greeted her like a blow. Laughter, wealth, and ego collided in a swell of noise. An engagement party, a long, burnished table glowed under chandeliers. At the head sat Alistair Valerius, heir, CEO, and corporate predator. He had the sculpted, bloodless beauty of a marble statue and the temperament to match. Beside him sparkled his fiancée, Isabella Beaumont, wired with diamonds and entitlement. The Beaumont textile empire was soon to be folded neatly into Valerius Global. Their engagement wasn't romance, it was consolidation. "And I told him," Isabella trilled, "if the yacht doesn't have a helipad, darling, it's just a boat." The sycophantic laughter that followed grated against Nolan's skull. She moved gracefully along the table, beginning the water service. Her body was present. Her mind wasn't. Her thoughts orbited the final notice email from her landlord, the empty prescription bottle for her brother Leo, and the doctor's careful, hesitant words. "There is an experimental treatment, Miss Vance, but the cost—" Isabella's chair jolted backward mid-laugh, bumping Nolan's arm. A splash of icy water dotted the silk sleeve of her dress. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. "You clumsy idiot!" Isabella hissed, recoiling as if burned. "This is custom Balenciaga. Do you have any idea what this costs?" "I'm terribly sorry, miss. Are you blaming me?" Isabella surged to her feet. "I want her fired." Nolan's heart stopped. Fired meant ruin. "Sit down, Isabella," Alistair said, bored, not bothering to look up. "It's water." "She ruined my dress. You have more on the jet." At last, Alistair looked at Nolan, cold, dissecting. "She's just a waitress. It's not as if she's a person." He smiled, a thin, cruel smirk, and the table laughed, relieved. The tension was broken. Nolan, humiliated and shaking, was dismissed with a wave. "Go get a towel, and try not to be a functional disaster for the rest of the evening." Nolan fled the room, her cheeks burning. She didn't go to get a towel. She went to the staff bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and pressed her forehead against the cold metal, fighting back the tears. It's not like she's a person. She checked her phone, a text from Leo. Brought home some pasta from the kitchen. You eat it when you get home. P.S. Watched that old video of you singing. You were amazing. Love you, E. The tears came then, hot and furious. She remembered that video. Juilliard, her final showcase, the standing ovation, the dean, Madame Renaud, whispering in her ear, "You have a voice that will define a generation, Nolan. Do not waste it." But a generation-defining voice couldn't pay for neurological specialists. A voice couldn't stop a father's cancer from eating through their savings or keep their mother from working herself into an early grave. So Nolan Vance, the prodigy, had vanished, and Nolan Vance, the waitress, punched in, punched out, and died a little more each day. She splashed cold water on her face, fixed her mask of invisibility, and walked back out. She had a job to finish. The evening wore on. The guests at the Valerius Beaumont party consumed food and wine that cost more than Nolan's annual salary. They discussed hostile takeovers, polo ponies, and the vulgarity of the new money in Silicon Valley. Nolan, now firmly in ghost mode, cleared plates with an efficiency that was almost aggressive. She didn't look at them. She didn't listen. She focused on the bone-white china, the leftover smears of truffle foam, the half-eaten figs. In the corner of the salon, a small string quartet had been playing forgettable Vivaldi. As they took a break, the conversation lulled. "Well," said Isabella, tapping her fork against her champagne flute to get everyone's attention. "This is quaint." She gestured to the musicians. "Alistair, darling, for the real wedding, we simply must have the Philharmonic. This plink-plink music is so common." Alistair, who was on his fourth glass of whiskey, nodded. "Art is wasted on the common man. They wouldn't know a Stradivarius from a fiddle." "You're such a patron of the arts, darling," Isabella cooed, stroking his arm. "I am a patron of excellence," Alistair corrected, his voice rising. He enjoyed being the center of attention. "I understand value. I can look at a company, or a painting, or a person, and know their exact worth in seconds." "A rare talent," his father, Marcus, said dryly, staring at his son over steepled fingers. It was not a compliment. Alistair ignored him. He was warming to his theme. "Take opera, for example. Most people think it's just fat people screaming. They don't understand the discipline, the training, the sheer god-like talent it takes to perform at the Met or La Scala." He was slurring slightly. He was performing for his fiancée, for his father, for the board members of Beaumont Textiles who sat at the table. He was trying to prove he wasn't just a rich kid, but a man of substance. "I, for one, could tell you," he announced, "if someone had real world-class talent in a single note." "Oh, Alistair, you're so brilliant," Isabella gushed. Nolan was clearing the dessert plates near Alistair's elbow. She was trying to be quiet, but her sleeve brushed a discarded spoon. It clattered against a plate. Alistair's head snapped toward her. The room went silent again. "You," he said, his eyes glinting with a new, cruel amusement. He pointed at her. "Waitress." Nolan froze. "Sir?" "You've been hovering all night. You must have an opinion. What do you think of opera?" Nolan's mind raced. "Be invisible. De-escalate. Apologize." I don't really have an opinion, sir. If you'll excuse me." "Ah, but I insist," Alistair said, leaning back. The table was now watching him, a king in his court, about to have some fun with a jester. "Come on. Have you ever even heard of Mozart?" "Yes, sir, I have." "Oh, good," he laughed. And what do you think? Do you prefer it to whatever noise you listen to on the subway?" The casual, unthinking cruelty of it stole her breath. I appreciate Mozart's compositions, sir. They are mathematically precise, and yet emotionally transcendent." The answer was too good. It was too articulate. Alistair's smirk faltered for a second. He had expected a, "Huh?" Isabella, sensing weakness, jumped in. "Oh, listen to her. Emotionally transcendent. She probably learned that from a movie. I bet she thinks The Phantom of the Opera is a real opera." The table tittered. Nolan stood rooted to the spot, her tray now weighing 1,000 pounds. Alistair recovered. He saw an opportunity not just to be amused, but to be dominant. To put this little waitress, with her surprisingly large vocabulary, back in her place. "You're right, darling." He turned back to Nolan. "It's easy to say words. It's harder to do things. You say you appreciate Mozart. Fine. Let's hear it." "Sir." Nolan's heart hammered against her ribs. "Sing," he commanded. "Sing some Mozart. For us. For your patrons." "Alistair, don't," Marcus Valerius said, his voice low. "This is unseemly." "It's fun, father," Alistair snapped, his authority challenged. "It's a party. I'm testing a theory. That talent is a myth for 99% of the population." He looked back at Nolan, his eyes predatory. "Well, are you going to sing, or are you just going to stand there looking stupid?" Nolan's throat was dry. The entire salon was staring at her. The musicians in the corner looked on with a mixture of pity and horror. Mr. Dubois was hovering in the doorway, his face pale. If she refused, she was fired. If she obeyed, she was a trained monkey. I can't, sir. I'm working." "Not anymore if you don't," Alistair said, his voice losing all its false cheer. It was a flat, cold command. "What do you want her to sing, Alistair?" Isabella giggled, already pulling out her phone to record the humiliation. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star?" "No," Alistair said, a truly malicious idea dawning. He was drunk, arrogant, and had been lightly contradicted by both his father and a waitress. He needed to reassert his power in the most absolute way possible. He turned to the pianist from the string quartet. "You, piano man, do you know the magic flute?" The pianist, a nervous man in his 50s, nodded. "Of course, sir. It's one of—" "Good," Alistair cut him off. "Do you know the Queen of the Night's aria? Der Hölle Rache?" The pianist's blood drained from his face. "Sir, that is widely considered one of the most difficult coloratura soprano arias ever written. It's not something one just sings." "Exactly," Alistair boomed, slamming his hand on the table. The crystal glasses jumped. "It is a test of excellence. Only a true, 1 in a million talent can perform it. A talent I would recognize." He turned his full, venomous attention back to Nolan. She was trapped. She felt the floor drop out from beneath her. "Here's the new game, waitress." He stood up, unsteadily. He was a large man, and his shadow fell over her. He pulled out a platinum money clip and tossed a $100 bill onto her tray. "Sing it. Sing Der Hölle Rache. If you amuse us, you can keep the tip." He was met with delighted, horrified gasps. This was the kind of dinner story they would tell for weeks. But Alistair wasn't done. He was playing to the crowd. He felt a sudden, bizarre surge of high-stakes gambling. "In fact," he announced to the room, "I'll make it even more interesting." He looked at Nolan, at her plain, terrified face, her worn shoes, her cheap, threadbare uniform. He saw a nothing, a zero. He smirked, the smirk that had eviscerated boards of directors. "If you can sing this opera aria, Der Hölle Rache, I'll marry you." The room exploded. Not in laughter. That was the shocking part. The bet was so absurd, so colossally arrogant, so insane, that it sucked the air from the room. People gasped. Isabella's jaw dropped. "Alistair!" she shrieked, this time in genuine horror. "What did you say?" "You heard me," he roared, drunk on his own audacity. "It's the safest bet in the world, because she can't do it. It's an impossibility. It's my way of proving my point, that this," he waved a hand at Nolan, "is a waitress, and the divers at the Met are divas, and never the twain shall meet." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that only Nolan could hear. His breath was hot with whiskey. "But I know you're going to refuse. You're going to cry. And then I'm going to have you fired. And I'll call every restaurant in my network, which is all of them, and I'll have you blacklisted. You'll be serving fries in Staten Island by Monday. Unless," he gestured to the small, empty stage area, "you sing." It was a perfect trap, a sociopath's masterpiece. He had given her two choices, both of which led to her annihilation. He would either destroy her livelihood, or he would destroy her dignity in a public display of failure. Nolan looked at Alistair's face. She looked at Isabella, who was now filming, a rabid grin on her face. She looked at Marcus Valerius, who was watching her with an intense, unreadable expression. And then she thought of Leo, of the eviction notice, of the specialist at Mount Sinai. Do not waste it. She closed her eyes. She took one slow, shuddering breath. She let the panic, the fear, the white-hot rage settle in her chest. She didn't push it down. She held it. She focused it. She opened her eyes. The terror was gone. In its place was a cold, clear, diamond-hard focus. She unclipped her name badge, Nolan, from her apron. She unfastened the apron strings and let the garment fall to the floor. She placed her silver tray on a nearby stand. She turned to the pianist. Her voice, when it came out, was not the mousy, apologetic tone of a waitress. It was the clear, resonant, and projecting voice of a first soprano. "Herr Klemperer," she said, reading the man's name off his small placard. "The aria is in D minor. I will take the introduction. Adagietto. And please, try to keep up." The pianist stared at her, his mouth open. Nolan turned, her back straight, her chin high, and walked to the small stage. The room was so quiet, she could hear the ice melting in Alistair Valerius's abandoned glass. The walk from the table to the small, parquet-floored stage area was only 20 feet, but for Nolan, it was a chasm. With every step, she shed a layer of her life. The exhaustion, the fear, the endless shifts, they peeled away. She wasn't Nolan Vance, the waitress. She was Nolan Vance, the prodigy who had been cheated of her destiny. And she was about to take it back. She nodded to the pianist. Herr Klemperer, still looking stunned, placed his shaking fingers on the keys. He began the introduction. The chords were dark, stormy, and fast. Nolan closed her eyes. She wasn't in L'Etoile d'Or. She was back in her Juilliard recital hall. She saw Madame Renaud in the front row, nodding. "Breathe from the diaphragm, Nolan. Support the sound. You are not asking, you are telling." Alistair had his arms crossed, his smirk cemented in place, waiting for the first screech. Isabella had her phone aimed, ready to capture the failure that would go viral among her friends. Nolan opened her mouth. "Der Höllerasche kocht in meinem Herzen. Hell's vengeance boils in my heart." The first note did not come from Nolan. It detonated. It was not quiet. It was not timid. It was a sound of such power, precision, and pure, unadulterated fury that it shook the crystal glasses on the table. It was a sound that had no place in this polite, hushed room. It was a sound from another world. Alistair Valerius dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor. but the sound was completely lost in the sheer volume of Nolan's voice. His smirk didn't just fade, it was ripped from his face, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed, profound shock. Isabella's phone lowered. Her mouth was open, the vapid, mocking look gone, replaced by simple, animal confusion. Marcus Valerius, the elder statesman, leaned forward, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He was the only one who seemed to understand what he was hearing. Nolan's voice climbed. The aria is a technical nightmare, a series of rapid-fire staccato runs and impossible leaps in pitch. It is designed to mimic the sound of rage itself. Nolan wasn't just singing the notes. She was channeling her own hell's vengeance. Her vengeance for her father's death. Her vengeance for her brother's illness. Her vengeance for the Juilliard dream that had been stolen. And her vengeance for every snide remark, every condescending glance, every just a waitress comment she had endured in this very room. She wasn't just singing. She was accusing. She held Alistair's gaze. Tod und Verzweiflung, flammet mich her. Death and despair, flame all around me. The pianist, Herr Klemperer, was no longer just accompanying. He was fighting to keep up. He was sweating, his eyes locked on Nolan, a look of pure awe on his face. He was playing better than he had in 20 years. The kitchen staff, alerted by the impossible sound, crowded the doorway. Mr. Dubois stood among them, his hands clasped to his chest, tears openly streaming down his face. Patrons from the main dining room were on their feet, peering in. Then came the moment, the legendary, terrifying climax. The high F's F6, to be precise. Notes that live in the stratosphere, notes that most professional sopranos fear. Nolan took a breath. She saw Alistair's face, pale, terrified. He knew he had made a terrible mistake. She didn't just hit the notes, she attacked them. They were not shrieks, they were laser beams. Clear, perfect, terrifying staccato notes that hammered the air. One after another, they pierced the atmosphere of the room, shattering the illusion of wealth and power, replacing it with something raw, ancient, and undeniable. She was the queen of the night. She was vengeance. She was a goddess of fury. She held the final, impossible high C, a note of pure, ringing triumph for what felt like an eternity. She poured every last ounce of her pain, her rage, and her soul into that one sound, and then she cut it off. Silence. A profound, echoing, absolute silence filled the room. No one breathed, no one moved. The only sound was Nolan's own harsh breathing as she stood, chest heaving, triumphant and terrible, on the small stage. She had not just sung an aria, she had waged a war. And she had won. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Nolan's chest heaved. The adrenaline was so potent it made her hands shake. She stared, not at the stunned crowd, but directly at the man who had challenged her. Alistair Valerius was the color of spoiled milk. He was a man who had never been surprised, never been wrong, and never been beaten. He was all three at once. Isabella was the first to speak, her voice a reedy, jealous whisper. She must have lip-synced. It's a trick. But no one was listening. Marcus Valerius, Alistair's father, was the one who broke the spell. He slowly, deliberately, rose from his chair. He was a formidable man, but his eyes were not on his son. They were on Nolan, and they were filled with a profound, calculating respect. He began to clap, not the polite applause of a dinner party, but the sharp, resounding clap of a real ovation. One by one, the other guests, the board members, the rivals, even the terrified musicians, joined him. Soon Salon B was filled with a thunderous, disbelieving applause. Nolan just watched Alistair. The applause died down. Nolan picked up the microphone, which the musicians used for small announcements. The small pop of it turning on made Alistair flinch. Her voice, amplified, was calm and dangerously steady. Mr. Valerius. He flinched. The terms of your bet, Nolan continued, her voice echoing in the salon, were, and I quote, "If you can sing this opera aria, I'll marry you." Isabella let out a sound like a strangled cat. "Alistair, tell her it was a joke. You can't be serious. You're marrying me." "Be silent, Isabella," Marcus Valerius snapped. The entire table flinched. His gaze was fixed on his son. "Alistair, the girl is right. That was the wager." "Father, this is ridiculous," Alistair managed, finding his voice. He was trying to regain control. "It was a joke, a party game." "A Valerius," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm, "does not make jokes about his word, not in front of the Beaumont board, not in front of our investors. A Valerius honors his commitments. You made a public declaration?" "A vow." The trap, Nolan realized, had snapped shut. But not on her. On him. Alistair looked around. He saw the faces of the Beaumont family, no longer amused but cold and assessing. He saw the other investors. He had made a fool of himself, and in his world, foolishness was worse than cruelty. It was a sign of weakness. If he broke a public vow, even one this insane, his credibility, the only currency that mattered, was shot. He was trapped. Nolan saw the calculation in his eyes, the panic, and she felt nothing. Not pity, just a cold, clean sense of victory. She took a step forward. "I believe, Mr. Valerius, you owe me a marriage proposal." Alistair looked at her, this waitress who had just humiliated him with a talent he didn't know existed. He looked at Isabella, who was on the verge of a hysterical breakdown. He looked at his father, whose face was granite. "This is blackmail," Alistair hissed at Nolan. "No," Nolan said clearly. "This is breach of contract, but I'm willing to negotiate." Alistair's head snapped up. This, he understood. This was business. "What?" "I have no desire to marry you, Mr. Valerius," Nolan said, and the relief that flooded Alistair's face was almost comical. "I find the very idea repulsive." A few people gasped. A waitress had just called Alistair Valerius repulsive. "I'm willing," Nolan continued, "to void this verbal contract, to release you from your obligation." "What do you want?" Alistair's voice was a low growl. "Money! How much? 50,000. Name your price." "My price," Nolan said, "is not something you can buy." She paused. "But it is something you will pay for." She walked, not to Alistair, but to his father. "Mr. Valerius," she said to Marcus, "my name is Nolan Vance. 3 years ago, I was the first scholar at Juilliard. My mentor was Madame Renaud. I was forced to drop out to care for my family." Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He knew the name. "I want my education back," Nolan said. 4 years, fully funded, not at Juilliard, at the Conservatorio Giuseppe Verdi in Milan, including living expenses." "Done," Marcus said, without even looking at his son. "I'm not finished," Nolan said. "I have a younger brother, Leo. He has a rare neurological condition. He is being treated at Mount Sinai. There is an experimental treatment, a new gene therapy. It costs $1.8 million. I want his medical care, all of it, covered. For life. At whatever clinic I choose." Isabella finally fainted, sliding ungracefully from her chair. No one moved to help her. Alistair was about to protest, but his father shot him a look that could freeze fire. "And finally," Nolan said, turning back to Alistair, "you humiliated me. You humiliated the staff of this restaurant. You treated us as if we were not people. I want a public apology. Not to me. To them. That was the blow, not the money. The money was nothing. But the apology. For a man like Alistair, it was death. You will stand in the main dining room, Nolan commanded, and you will apologize to Mr. Dubois, to the chefs, and to the waitstaff for your behavior. Absolutely not, Alistair snarled. Then I'll see you at the courthouse, Nolan said, turning to go. I'm sure the New York Post will love the headline. CEO forced to marry waitress after losing drunken bet. It should do wonders for your merger. You... Alistair was shaking with rage. Alistair! Marcus barked. The CEO of Valerius Global flinched like a child. You will agree to her terms, all of them. You have disgraced this family, and this is your penance. Alistair looked at Nolan. Her face was calm. She had won. She had taken his arrogance and his cruelty and forged it into a key that would unlock her own life and save her brother's. Fine, Alistair bit out, the word tearing from his throat. Fine. My lawyers will. No lawyers, Nolan said. She walked to the table and picked up a clean, heavy linen napkin and a pen. Here. Now, you will write it down, an agreement in principle. And you, she looked at Marcus, will sign it as a witness, along with Mr. Beaumont. She was, Marcus Valerius realized, the most ruthless person in the room. He had never been more impressed. He smiled. Give me the pen. The final, perfect C-sharp still hung in the air, a ghost of a sound that had more power than any of the assembled billionaires. Nolan stood, chest heaving, the adrenaline of her performance making the crystal chandelier swim in her vision. The room was locked in a profound, terrified silence. Alistair Valerius was the colour of old parchment. He was a man who had never been surprised, never been wrong, and never, ever been so comprehensively defeated. He stared at Nolan, not as a man looks at a waitress, but as a man looks at a phenomenon he cannot possibly comprehend. He had made a joke. A god had answered. Isabella, her phone still dangling from her hand, was the first to try and recalibrate reality. She must have lip-synced, she whispered, her voice a reedy, jealous hiss. It's a trick. It has to be. But no one was listening. Marcus Valerius, Alistair's father, was the one who broke the spell. His face was a mask of cold calculation. He had not heard a song. He had heard a threat and an opportunity. He slowly, deliberately rose from his chair. He was a formidable man, and his eyes were not on his son. They were on Nolan, and they were filled with a profound, terrifying respect. He began to clap. It was not the polite, scattered applause of a dinner party. It was a sharp, measured, resonant clap. 1, 2, 3. It was the sound of a judge striking a gavel. One by one, the other guests, the stunned board members, the rival investors, even the weeping pianist Herr Klemperer, joined him. Soon, Salon B was filled with a thunderous, disbelieving ovation. It was not applause for a performance, it was applause for a survivor. Nolan let it wash over her for a moment. She let the sound be a balm on 3 years of raw, open wounds. Then, her breathing steadying, she raised a hand. The applause stopped, instantly. She had their full attention. She unpinned her small plastic name badge, Nolan, from her shirt. She didn't drop it. She placed it deliberately on her tray. She was no longer a name badge. She was a person. She picked up the microphone the musicians used for small announcements. The small pop of it turning on made Alistair flinch. Her amplified voice was calm, clear, and dangerously steady. Mr. Valerius? He winced. That was... The terms of your bet, Nolan continued, her voice echoing in the salon, cutting him off, were, and I quote, "If you can sing this opera aria, I'll marry you." Isabella let out a sound like a strangled cat. "Alistair, this is insane. Tell her it was a joke. You can't be serious. You are marrying me." "Be silent, Isabella," Marcus Valerius snapped, his voice a whip crack. The entire table, including Isabella's father, flinched. His gaze was fixed on his son. "Alistair, the girl is right. That was the wager. You made it in front of me, and you made it in front of the entire Beaumont board. A Valerius," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm, "does not make jokes about his word. A Valerius honors his commitments." The trap, Nolan realized, had snapped shut, but it was not on her. It was on him. Alistair looked wildly around. He saw the faces of the Beaumont family, no longer amused but cold and assessing. This was not a joke. It was a character flaw. This was instability. This was a liability. He saw the other investors, their faces unreadable. He had made a fool of himself, and in his world, foolishness was worse than cruelty. It was a sign of weakness. If he broke a public vow, even one this insane, his credibility, the only currency that mattered, was shot. He was trapped. "This is blackmail," Alistair hissed, his voice low and trembling with a rage he couldn't unleash. "No, Mr. Valerius," Nolan said, taking a step toward the table. "This is breach of contract, but I find myself in a generous mood. I am willing to negotiate." Alistair's head snapped up. This he understood. This was business. "What?" "I have no desire to marry you, Mr. Valerius," Nolan said, and the relief that flooded Alistair's face was so profound it was almost comical. "I find the very idea repulsive." A few people gasped. A waitress had just called Alistair Valerius repulsive. "I am willing," Nolan continued, her voice like ice, "to void this verbal contract, to release you from your obligation." "What do you want?" Alistair growled, falling back into his comfort zone. This was a shakedown. "Money? How much? 50,000? 100? Name your price." "My price," Nolan said, "is not something you can just buy. It is something you will pay for." She turned, in a move of pure strategic genius, away from Alistair. She addressed his father. "Mr. Valerius," she said to Marcus, "my name is Nolan Vance. 3 years ago, I was the first scholar at Juilliard. My mentor was Madame Renaud. I was forced to drop out to care for my family." Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He knew the name. Renaud was a legend. "I want my education back," Nolan said. 4 years, fully funded, not at Juilliard. I want to go to the best, the Conservatorio Giuseppe Verdi in Milan, including all tuition and living expenses." "Done," Marcus said, without even looking at his son. "I'm not finished," Nolan said, her voice hardening. "I have a younger brother, Leo. He has a rare neurological condition. He is being treated at Mount Sinai. There is an experimental treatment, a new gene therapy. It costs $1.8 million. I want his medical care, all of it, covered, for life, at whatever clinic I choose, anywhere in the world." Isabella Beaumont finally fainted, sliding ungracefully from her chair. No one moved to help her. "This is," Alistair began, but his father shot him a look that could freeze fire. And finally, Nolan said, turning her burning gaze back to the man who had started it all, "You humiliated me. You humiliated the staff of this restaurant. You treated us as if we were not people. I want a public apology." That was the blow, not the money. The money was nothing. But the apology. For a man like Alistair, it was a public execution. "Absolutely not," Alistair snarled. "Then I'll see you at the courthouse," Nolan said, turning to go. I'm sure the New York Post will love the headline, CEO forced to marry waitress after losing drunken bet. It should do wonders for your merger. I wonder what your stock price will do on Monday. You! Alistair was shaking. Alistair! Marcus barked. The CEO of Valerius Global flinched like a child. You will agree to her terms, all of them. You have disgraced this family, and this is your penance. Alistair looked at Nolan. Her face was calm, implacable. She had won. She had taken his arrogance and his cruelty and forged it into a key that would unlock her own life and save her brother's. Fine, Alistair bit out, the word tearing from his throat. Fine, my lawyers will— No lawyers, Nolan said. Not yet. I want it now. She walked to the table and picked up a clean, heavy linen napkin and a pen from the inner pocket of Alistair's discarded suit jacket. Here, now. You will write it down, an agreement in principle. And you, she looked at Marcus, will sign it as a witness, along with Mr. Beaumont. She was, Marcus Valerius realized, the most ruthless person in the room. He had never been more impressed. He smiled, a thin, wolfish grin. Give me the pen, son. Alistair, his hand shaking, wrote on the linen. Each word was a nail in his coffin. I agree to fund the education of Nolan Vance. I agree to cover the lifetime medical care of Leo Vance. And the sum, Nolan added, her voice cold, for my brother's immediate care, so I can get him into the clinic tomorrow. Write a bank draft for $2 million to be delivered to me by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Alistair's hand cramped, but he wrote it. He signed. Marcus signed. Mr. Beaumont, his own daughter's engagement now in ashes, looked at Alistair with contempt, and then at Nolan with a strange respect. He, too, understood leverage. He signed. Nolan took the napkin. She folded it neatly and put it in her skirt pocket. Thank you, gentlemen. She turned. Now, the apology. The procession from Salon B to the main dining room was a funeral march. Alistair walked first, his father and Mr. Beaumont flanking him like guards. Nolan walked behind, her head held high. Mr. Dubois, seeing them, lightly rang the service bell. The main dining room, which had been buzzing with rumors, went quiet. The diners looked up. The entire staff, waiters, busboys, sommeliers, stopped, frozen. Alistair Valerius, the King of New York, stood in the center of the room. He looked at the staff. His jaw worked. Speak, Marcus ordered. Alistair's voice was a strained monotone. I wish to apologize. He looked at Mr. Dubois. My behavior tonight was unacceptable. I treated the staff with disrespect. I was wrong. It will not happen again. It was the most humiliating moment of his life. For Nolan, it was the only one that mattered. She watched the faces of her colleagues. She saw their shock, and then a slow, dawning sense of vindication. Mr. Dubois, Nolan said, her voice clear in the silence. I quit. Ms. Vance, Mr. Dubois said, his eyes shining, and for the first time he smiled. It was an honor. Nolan nodded. She turned, walked past the Valerius family, past the stunned patrons to the staff locker room. She gathered her things, her cheap purse, and her worn-out shoes. She left her key on the counter. She walked out the front door of l'Étoile d'Or. The doorman, who had never once looked her in the eye, now rushed to open it for her. Good night, Miss Vance. Good night, Thomas. She walked into the cool November air. She didn't take a cab. She walked the 20 blocks to the subway, the linen napkin a solid, warm weight in her pocket. When she got to her tiny apartment, Leo was asleep on the fold-out couch. She knelt beside him, put her head on his chest, and for the first time in 3 years, she wept. But this time, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. The next morning, at 8:52:80, a stone-faced courier from the law firm of Hadley and Price, LLP, delivered a bank draft for $2 million. Nolan held it, the paper heavy in her hand. It was real. She made 2 calls. The first was to the specialist at Mount Sinai. "Dr. Aris," she said, her voice shaking. "This is Nolan Vance, Leo's sister. I have the funds. When can we start?" The second call was to Italy, 2 years later. The Piazza della Scala was a sea of flashing cameras and black limousines. In Milan, the opening night of the season at the Teatro alla Scala was not merely a social event. It was a cultural sacrament. The air crackled with an electric, almost religious anticipation. This was the temple of opera, the hallowed ground where Maria Callas had reigned, where Pavarotti had become immortal. And tonight, the temple was nervous. The season was opening with Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor, a jewel of the bel canto repertoire. But the posters and programs did not feature a reigning, established diva. The Milanese critics, the most ruthless in the world, had been sharpening their knives for weeks over the controversial casting. The lead was going to an unknown, an American, a singer who had appeared from nowhere, a graduate of the Conservatorio who had bypassed the entire traditional system of provincial debuts. Her name was Nolan Vance. The Milanese press, with their flair for drama, had already nicknamed her La Sconosciuta, the unknown one. Inside the legendary theatre, all red velvet, carved wood and staggering gold leaf, the atmosphere was thick. Every box was full. The logionisti, the infamously critical fans in the upper galleries, were packed in, their programs held like weapons, ready to cheer a new sun or, more likely, to boo a falling star into oblivion. Backstage in dressing room 3, Nolan Vance sat before a mirror. It was a far cry from the cramped, foul-smelling staff locker at l'Étoile d'Or. This room had history. A faded watermark on the wall was rumoured to be from a champagne bottle Callas herself had thrown. Nolan looked at her reflection. The woman who stared back was not the pale, tired ghost who had served billionaires. The exhaustion was still there, but it was a different kind. It was the exhaustion of work, not despair. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes were clear, and her shoulders, once slumped in service, were now set with the strength of her diaphragm. She was 26 years old, and she looked, finally, like herself. For 2 years, she had done nothing but breathe, study, and sing. She had arrived in Milan with a bank draft that felt like blood money and a brother who was weak but alive. The Conservatorio had been brutal. Her raw, rage-fueled talent had been systematically dismantled by mentors who were even more exacting than Madame Renaud. They had broken her bad habits, forced her to relearn her breathing, and drilled her in Italian until she dreamed in it. She had practiced scales until her throat bled, studied theory until her head spun, and all the while she had willed Leo back to health. She looked at the small, silver-framed photo on her dressing table. It was her and Leo, not in a hospital, but standing in the snow-dusted Piazza del Duomo, squinting in the winter sun. Leo was standing. He was tall. He was, impossibly, healthy. The clinical trial, funded by Alistair Valerius's napkin contract, had been a success. The experimental gene therapy had, as the doctors put it, performed a miracle. Leo Vance was in full remission. He was now a thriving, argumentative 20-year-old, enrolled in his first year of architecture at the Politecnico di Milano, just a few blocks away. He was out there tonight, in the 3rd row, seat 3B. She had bought the ticket with her very first performance stipend. "You're not singing for them, you know," Leo had told her that morning, his Italian now almost better than hers. "You're not even singing for you. You're singing for the girl who was trapped. Sing her free, E." A sharp rap on the door. "Signorina Vance, 5 minuti." 5 minutes. Nolan stood. She was already in costume for the opera's climax, a simple white nightgown. Lucia's wedding night, which would also be her descent into madness. She walked from her dressing room toward the wings. The scent of old velvet, dust, and lemon-scented floor polish filled her lungs. She heard the distant swell of the orchestra tuning. Her heart wasn't hammering with fear. It was thrumming with a low, powerful engine of readiness. She thought, just for a second, of that night at the restaurant. The rage was still there, a cold, hard ember deep inside her. But it was no longer a wildfire. It was a forge. It was the heat she used to shape her art. She was not going to sing at anyone tonight. She was simply going to sing. At the very back of the theatre, in the shadows of a small private box purchased at triple the price under the name Mr. A. Vane, a man sat alone. He was thinner than he used to be. The predatory, slicked-back hair of a Wall Street raider was gone, replaced by a shorter, simpler cut, touched with an aristocratic grey at the temples. The bespoke Brioni suit had been replaced by a simple, dark cashmere turtleneck and jacket. He was no longer Alistair Valerius, CEO. He was just Alistair. He had not come for forgiveness. He knew with a certainty that had been burned into him over 2 years of forced exile, that he was beyond forgiveness. He had come because he was compelled. He had to see the end of the story he had so cruelly and stupidly begun. His father had been merciless. The moment the Beaumont merger collapsed, taking with it Isabella's family's respect and $1 billion valuation, Marcus Valerius had convened an emergency board meeting. Alistair was stripped of his title and forced to take an indefinite sabbatical. He was sent to a private clinic in Zurich, ostensibly for exhaustion. It was there, in the sterile, quiet rooms overlooking a placid lake, that a therapist had finally unlocked the source of his poison. He'd dug into Alistair's past the arrogance and the privilege, to a core memory. His mother. A beautiful, aspiring soprano who was, as his father had cruelly put it, all ambition and no talent. She had tried and failed to make a name for herself, and the bitterness of it had curdled her. She had abandoned Alistair and his father when he was 8, running off with a tenor from the New City Opera. Alistair's hatred of opera, his need to mock it, his specific, venomous challenge to Nolan. It was all a twisted, subconscious reenactment. He had been trying to humiliate his mother over and over again. He had hated Nolan for being the one to finally make it stick. He had hated her with a corrosive passion as he liquidated $5 million in personal stock to cover the lifetime of care for her brother. But the hate had, over 2 years of silence and reflection, faded. It had been replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness, which was slowly, painfully, being filled by something new, understanding. He had flown to Milan not as a conqueror, but as a penitent. He was here to witness the consequences of his actions. He was here to listen, for the very first time, to the art form he had so viciously despised. He watched as the lights went down. The opera began. The first act was a triumph. The audience was reserved but appreciative. La Sconosciuta had a voice that was certain, clear, powerful, and precise. But it was the final act they were all waiting for, the infamous Scena della Pazzia, the mad scene. The stage was dark. A hush fell over the 2,000 people in the audience. The orchestra began the haunting, mournful introduction. Nolan made her entrance. She was a vision in white, her hair undone, her eyes wide with a terrifying, ethereal emptiness. She was Lucia, a woman who had been forced into a loveless marriage, who had just murdered her new husband, and whose mind had finally, tragically, snapped. She began to sing. Her first notes were so quiet or so delicate, a pianissimo that somehow reached the very last row of the gallery, that the audience gasped as one. This was not the brute force she had used in the restaurant. This was the work of a master. And then the duet began. Not with another singer, but with the glass harmonica, its eerie, crystalline notes representing the whispers in her shattered mind. Nolan's voice danced with it. Her coloratura runs not just technically perfect, but imbued with a heartbreaking, childish sorrow. She was not acting mad. She was channeling every moment of her own near madness. She poured in the grief of her father's death. She poured in the white-hot panic of Leo's diagnosis. She poured in the humiliation of Alistair's sneer, the despair of the eviction notice, the grinding, soul-killing exhaustion of 1,000 shifts. She was taking all the ugliest, most broken parts of her past and transforming them into something profoundly, terrifyingly beautiful. In the third row, Leo watched his sister, tears streaming down his face. He was not crying for Lucia. He was crying for Nolan. In the back of the house, Alistair sat rigid, his hands gripping the velvet railing of the box. He finally understood. He had thought opera was fat people screaming. He was listening to a single slender woman in a white dress hold 2,000 people in absolute, breathless thrall. He was witnessing an act of pure, distilled genius. This was excellence. This was power, not a hostile takeover, not a stock price. This. He had not just been wrong. He had been a fool, an ignorant, privileged, pathetic fool. On stage, Nolan was reaching the climax. The aria climbed, higher and higher, a desperate, brilliant ascent. She soared, her voice a laser beam of pure, transcendent sound, culminating in the legendary, impossibly high E-flat. She did not hit the note. She became it. It was not a note of rage, like the one that had shattered Alistair's world. It was a note of pure, heartbreaking, divine release. She held it. Time stopped. And then, as the role demanded, she collapsed, a heap of white linen on the dark stage. The conductor's baton was frozen in the air. For a full 10 seconds, there was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it felt louder than any sound. It was the collective, stunned heartbeat of everyone in the building. Then, from the Logionisti, the highest gallery, a single man stood up and roared. "Brave!" It was as if a dam had broken. La Scala erupted. The theatre did not just applaud, it exploded. People were on their feet, screaming, shouting, weeping. "Divina! La Meraviglia!" The critics in the press box were not writing. They were standing and applauding, a sight almost never seen. Roses, tied with ribbons, rained down from the upper boxes, showering the stage. In his box, Alistair did not applaud. He couldn't. He watched the adulation, the love, the pure, unadulterated triumph. He had offered her his name in marriage as a joke, and in return, she had taken his entire world as payment, and he was grateful for it. She had, in her own way, saved him from the man he was. He waited until the curtain came down, before the lights came up for the bows. He knew this moment was not for him. He stood, a shadow in the darkness, and turned to leave. On a small table by the door was a donation box for the theatre's restoration fund. He pulled out a checkbook, an old, ingrained habit, and a pen. He wrote a check for 2 million euros. He signed it. Not A. Vane, but Alistair Valerius. A quiet, anonymous act of penance. He left it on the table and disappeared into the Milanese night, a ghost, forever haunted and forever changed by the night a waitress sang. On stage, the curtain calls were deafening. The cast bowed. The conductor bowed. Then the entire cast parted, leaving Nolan alone. The maestro gestured to her. She stepped forward, her face stained with theatrical blood and real tears. She was Nolan Vance, not Lucia. The lights were blinding. She looked out, past the roaring darkness, to the third row. She found him. Leo. He was on his feet, his hands cupped around his mouth, cheering so loudly his face was red. He was alive. He was here. She looked at him. And the last 2 years, the last 3 years, the entire nightmare, culminated in this one perfect moment. She had won. She hadn't needed to marry the CEO. She hadn't needed his name. She had become her own. Nolan Vance, the girl from Juilliard, the waitress from L'Étoile d'Or, La Sconosciuta, put her hand on her heart, and to the thundering acclaim of the world's greatest opera house, she bowed. She was not a princess, not a victim. She was the queen. Thank you for joining us for this dramatic story. What a journey from a humiliated waitress to the queen of La Scala. Nolan proved that talent, dignity, and a spine of steel are worth more than all the money in the world. She didn't just win her future, she negotiated it on her own terms, turning her oppressor's arrogance into her ultimate victory. What did you think of Nolan's revenge? Was it justice? Let me know your favorite part of the story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of triumph and justice, please show your support by hitting that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a great comeback story, and be sure to subscribe.